Hey guys, tonight we drift softly into the damp and smoky folds of medieval Europe, where belief was more powerful than fact and superstition shaped the breath of every morning. This isn't the part of history with knights in polished armor or fair ladies weaving by the fire. No, this is the shadowed edge of the map. A forgotten village curled deep in the trees where the forest hummed with secrets, and every soul watched the sky for signs. They called it Elderbrook, a place of wet stone walls and thatched roofs, of narrow paths muddied by centuries of footsteps. The church stood at its heart, cracked and weary, its bell tolling not just for prayers, but for warnings. And beyond that church, past the last of the grazing goats and the crooked wooden crosses nailed to trees, there lived a girl whose name stirred more unease than thunder. Before we settle into her tale, maybe ease into your blanket a bit deeper. Dim the lights around you, or let the gentle hum of a fan keep you company. If you found yourself enjoying these sleepy wanderings through history, you're welcome to like the video and join the quiet little circle that gathers here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me where you're listening from and what time the world is for you right now. It's always comforting knowing how far these quiet hours travel. Now let the outside world blur and fade and follow me back to a colder time where truth and fear often wore the same cloak. The girl was named Marit, 16, though she never celebrated her birthday, and her hands always smelled faintly of rosemary and wet bark. She lived alone in a crooked cottage tucked so close to the tree line the ivy had started to pull at the roof as though trying to swallow the place back into the earth. Her mother had died 2 winters ago. Fever took her quickly, with no priest to help and no coin for proper prayers. Marit had been alone since, except for the herbs, the wild birds, and the people who came knocking when no one else could help them. She never turned them away. Her salves soothed burns, her teas quieted coughs, and her fingers knew how to find the ache hiding beneath a rib. No one taught her. It was just something that passed down quietly, like the color of her eyes or the way she hummed to herself while grinding roots. By day, they called her strange. By night, they came whispering to her door. They left eggs on her stoop and wool scraps on her windowsill. They never said thank you, not properly, but she didn't mind. She wasn't doing it for them, not really. The truth was more tangled than that. She healed because something inside her stirred when she touched broken things, like a memory that wasn't quite hers, rising to the surface. But there were always those who didn't like what they didn't understand. And in Elderbrook that was most things. The old priest had tolerated her. He was tired, half-blind, and feared the church bell more than he feared the devil. But the new one, Father Theobald, came from the cathedral in the south with his iron cross and his carefully folded letters sealed with wax. He spoke softly, but held his words like knives. He saw her once, only once, standing by the stream with a bundle of birch leaves in her hands. He didn't speak, just stared, as if deciding something. And that night, Marit couldn't sleep. There was something different in the wind. It no longer carried just the damp scent of wood smoke and moss. It carried something more bitter, ash and judgment. And though the village looked the same crooked roofs, the same bent backs in the fields, Marit felt the air around her shift, like the forest itself had taken a breath and was holding it. That was the first night she dreamed of fire. Not the safe kind, not hearth fire, not the flicker of candles dancing across the pages of a prayer book. This fire crackled louder. It moved like it had a purpose, like it was looking for her. And the worst part, she didn't wake up afraid, she woke up remembering. Marit woke with a tightness in her chest. the lingering traces of heat dancing behind her eyes. The dream clung to her like smoke clings to wool, hard to shake and harder to forget. The light in her cottage was still dim, filtered through a smear of waxed parchment that passed for a window. Her little hearth, long since gone cold, held a pale bed of ash, and nothing more. But even in the dull morning quiet, she could almost hear the echo of crackling. She sat up slowly, wrapping her thin shawl around her shoulders, brushing a few dry leaves off her blanket. The forest liked to sneak in during the night. Twigs, beetles, pine needles, she didn't mind. It was the wind that unsettled her now, carrying whispers she couldn't quite catch. The kettle sat empty on the fire brick. No tea this morning. Her stores were thinning. The winter had been harsher than usual, and the spring, though it had technically arrived, seemed reluctant to commit. Buds had barely appeared on the birch trees and the ground remained hard. In places it should have softened weeks ago. The villagers called it a bad omen. Marit called it a delay. But either way, it meant her usual wild ingredients were slower to appear. She had used the last of her dried valerian root on widow Elena's night terrors 3 days ago, and now even the elderberries she relied on for fever relief were nowhere to be found. She tied her boots with stiff fingers and stepped outside, the mist curling around her ankles like cautious cats. The forest greeted her as it always did, quiet, watching, not unfriendly, but not offering anything either. She picked her way carefully along the edge of the moss path, keeping close to the creek. It was clearer here than in the village, though the priest had once muttered it was cursed water. She had stopped drinking from the village well years ago, not because of superstition, but because it tasted faintly of iron and despair. The creek was different, cold, clean, and constant. It had never let her down. As she knelt to fill her clay jug, something shimmered briefly across the surface. Not light, not shadow, just a flicker of something old, a memory perhaps, a voice, her mother's maybe, or something deeper, pulled from marrow instead of mind. She shook it off gently, not harshly, like brushing cobwebs from a sleeve. These moments came sometimes. Ever since the fever took her mother and the dreams began, they came more often, but they never lasted long and never made sense. She only knew that after they passed, she always felt just a little more certain. Like she knew which route to dig or which tincture to trust. The villagers didn't know this part. They thought she had learned from old books or from a crone in the hills, or perhaps, depending on the mood of the wind that day, from the devil himself. They didn't ask. They just came to her when their children burned with fever or when their bones clicked in the cold. They knocked with eyes cast down and hands full of guilt, muttering half prayers even as they begged her to help, and she always did. But lately the visits had slowed, and when they came faster, with fewer words, more fear. She saw it in their eyes, the way they avoided hers, the way they hesitated before stepping over her threshold. Something had shifted since the arrival of Father Theobald. He had spoken little in public, but his presence carried weight. He was younger than most expected and sharper. He didn't shout sermons, but his silences were louder than thunder. And he was watching, not just her, all of them. Back in the village square, a small crowd had begun to gather near the church steps. Marit paused among the trees, jug in hand, barely breathing. She could see the glint of his silver cross from here. He was speaking slowly, arms folded behind his back. The villagers listened with still shoulders and wide eyes. Whatever he said, it was sinking in deep. And then he raised a bundle in his hands, twigs, kindling, tied in rope. It was small, nothing more than a demonstration perhaps, but the message rang clear. The villagers didn't move, They didn't cheer, but they didn't walk away either. Marit watched until the last figure stepped inside the church, then turned toward the woods, with the creek still dripping down her fingers. The fire from her dream hadn't come yet, but now it had a shape, and it had a name. The morning passed in stillness, the kind that doesn't comfort, but stretches long and thin like thread pulled too tight. Marit moved slowly through her day, not out of laziness, but out of instinct. The forest around her had gone too quiet. Even the birds, usually bold enough to chatter from the hedgerow, seemed hushed today. Her hands kept busy, tying bundles of dried mint with rough twine, grinding bark into powder with the flat stone she'd used since she was a child. It kept her grounded. It reminded her of the years before her mother's eyes went glassy and distant, before the coughing fits, before the night she burned feverishly and whispered things Marit hadn't understood then and still tried not to understand now. She hadn't cried that night. She remembered that clearly. Her hands had moved as they had been trained to, fetching cloths and cool water, murmuring soft things even though her voice trembled. But her eyes had remained dry, even when the last breath slipped from her mother's chest. Only later, when the silence grew thick and the cold came down like a second skin, did the tears finally come, strange and hot on her cheeks, surprising her as though they didn't belong to her at all. Since then, she'd managed on her own. The villagers brought their problems and left with quiet gratitude or awkward silence. Her cottage stayed whole through storms, her herbs kept people breathing, and that was enough. Or it had been. But something had shifted. It wasn't just Father Theobald's presence, it was something older, more tangled, like roots, long buried, beginning to stir again. She could feel it in her own bones, a tension like a held breath, like the moment before a branch snaps underfoot. The kind of fear that didn't come from words, but from the way people moved, the way they looked at her now, not with respect or even suspicion, but with the kind of dread usually reserved for bad omens carved in bark or crows that circled 3 times. She stepped outside again near midday, more from habit than purpose. The wind had picked up, low and slow, dragging clouds across the sky like tired sails. She pulled her shawl tighter around her and walked down the narrow path to where the village gardens began. They weren't her gardens, but she'd helped start them years ago, back when the blight had killed nearly half the potato crop, and the only thing standing between the children and starvation had been the plants she coaxed out of the ruined soil. People remembered that, or at least they used to. Today there was no one working the rows. Just a single figure bent near the cabbages, digging with a dull blade. She recognized him at once. Tom, a quiet boy with one lazy eye and a limp from a badly healed injury. He was nearly a man now, tall and awkward, and his hands looked more like a blacksmith's than a farmer's. He didn't hear her approach. When she called his name softly, he startled so hard he dropped his blade. His face went pale. He didn't meet her eyes. "I only came to see how the soil's holding," she said gently. "That frost the other night didn't help much?" He nodded quickly, too quickly, and muttered something about needing to finish his work. She asked nothing more, just watched him for a moment before turning away. But as she stepped past him, he whispered, barely loud enough for the breeze to carry. "They're saying things about you, about the firewood." She paused, her back still to him. The world seemed to narrow for a moment, all edges and breadth. "I know," she said without turning. There was silence again, but this one was warmer somehow, almost pitying. "They don't want to believe it," Tom said, and she could hear the conflict in his voice. "But they're afraid. He's clever. He talks quiet, but it gets inside people. They say the sickness in the next valley came from someone like you, that she cursed the bread, that she turned cows dry with just a look." Marit sighed and stared at her feet. The moss beneath her boots had turned brown with the season's slow change. She felt older, suddenly, heavier. "They don't understand what they're saying," she murmured. "I know," he replied, and for a moment his voice was just a boy's again. When she left the garden, the clouds had thickened above. A dull grey blanketed the sky, pressing low like a lid. Somewhere behind her, a church bell rang out once, not for service, not for death, just a single, steady toll. A warning. By the time Marit returned to her cottage, her feet were damp through and her thoughts wouldn't settle. The sound of the bell still rang faintly in her ears, that single toll echoing longer than it had any right to. Her hands shook just slightly as she poured water from the clay jug into the shallow basin by the hearth. She didn't light a fire, not yet. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of dried sage and the last of the smoked apples hanging from the rafters. She sat in silence, fingers resting on her knees, eyes unfocused. Somewhere out in the woods, a bird gave a short call and then went quiet. Tom's words had stuck like burrs to her ribs. She hadn't needed him to tell her, not really. She had felt it creeping in for days, soft as fog, curling into corners where trust used to live. But hearing it said aloud, even in a whisper, changed something. It made it real. People were talking, not just in hushed kitchens or while tilling the frozen edges of fields. They were talking in pews, in gatherings, under the eye of the priest whose words carried the weight of heaven and the threat of fire. She rubbed her palms together slowly, trying to warm them without flame. Her mother had once said that cold hands meant a guarded heart, but Marit didn't feel guarded. She felt raw, like the skin around her soul had been peeled thin. She remembered when the villagers used to smile at her as she passed. Small things, a nod, a loaf left on her doorstep, a thank you murmured in passing. Now they crossed themselves too quickly, watched her too long, or not at all. The worst part wasn't the fear, it was the knowing. She knew these people, had grown up beside them. She remembered wrapping linen around little Jorik's broken wrist when he fell from the apple tree. She remembered singing lullabies to Anna's child while the mother bled in the next room and Marit's hands worked feverishly to keep death at bay. These weren't strangers. They were the ones who had once trusted her. And now they were looking for reasons to forget they ever had. The door creaked in the wind, even though it was latched. Just the wood, swelling with moisture probably. Still, she stood and checked it, her fingers pressing lightly to the rough edges. She'd carved protective symbols there years ago. Not from fear, not then. It had been more of a habit, a tradition her mother said was older than memory. Circles within circles, lines that curled in on themselves like vines. She'd forgotten the exact meanings, but they had always brought her a quiet sort of comfort. Now, her fingers traced them not with reverence, but with a silent plea. Outside, the mist was thickening again, clinging low to the ground. It would be dark soon. The clouds hadn't lifted since morning, and the sun had given up trying to press through. Marit pulled her shawl tighter and glanced toward the woods. The trees loomed like quiet sentinels, neither hostile nor kind, just watching. There was a part of her that longed to vanish into them, to disappear between the trunks and let the village forget her altogether. But something else held her in place. A weight in her chest, not fear exactly, but something heavier. Obligation, perhaps, or maybe pride. She hadn't done anything wrong. That much she held on to like a thread. She had healed. She had helped. And if she had spoken words while doing so that didn't come from a book, and if her hands moved in ways that echoed generations of women before her, that didn't make her wicked, it made her what she was. Something old. Something that the church didn't understand and didn't want to. She turned away from the door, but stopped. There, on the ground near the threshold, was a single object, small, wrapped in cloth. She crouched slowly, heart tightening. The bundle smelled faintly of lye and rosemary. Carefully, she unwrapped it. Inside was a dead sparrow, its wings bound with red thread. A sign. She didn't move for a long time, just stared at it. The meaning was clear. Someone had made this, not by accident, not out of fear. This wasn't a warning from the priest. This came from someone else, someone who knew what that kind of binding meant and what it could awaken. Marit didn't touch the sparrow again after unwrapping it. She simply stared, her knees bent and her breath shallow, the chill from the open door creeping up her spine. The red thread around its wings was wound tightly, a practiced hand's work. It hadn't frayed, hadn't slipped, hadn't been cut with hesitation. It had been tied with intent, sealed with something more than cloth. That was what unsettled her. Not the death, not the small weight of the bird, but the knowing. Whoever placed this had knowledge. Not the kind that comes from books, but the kind passed from mouth to ear in the hush of kitchens and woods. The kind only shared when the shutters were closed and the wind was still. She wrapped the cloth back around it and set the bundle gently into a small wooden box near the hearth, a box that once held dried thistle and sage, but now sat nearly empty. It didn't feel right to throw it away. Whatever it was meant to say, it wasn't finished. There was a message tucked inside the gesture, and that message would need watching. She closed the lid slowly, like sealing a jar of bees. Not afraid exactly, just cautious, or that kind of caution that runs in the blood and doesn't need explaining. As the evening began to settle over the trees, she moved around the cottage with quiet purpose. Her hands found rhythm in old motions, hanging herbs to dry above the hearth, sorting jars, checking the last of her supplies. The light faded fast, not just because of the clouds, but because the days were still short, and the forest had a way of swallowing what little light remained. She lit a single candle, not bothering with more. The shadows were easier when they were left alone. Later, as night deepened, she sat beside the unlit hearth with her knees drawn to her chest, a rough wool blanket around her shoulders, and her mind heavy with echoes. It had been years since anyone used old signs like the sparrow binding. Most of the village had forgotten the old ways. They followed Father Theobald now, or at least pretended to. They still knocked on her door when fever struck, but they didn't say her name out loud anymore. She wondered who had left it. Someone from the village? Or someone passing through who remembered what she came from more clearly than she did herself. There were moments when she thought she heard her mother's voice in the stillness, not as a sound, but as a sense, like a hand resting briefly on her shoulder, or the sudden clarity of a thought that wasn't entirely hers. Her mother had known things, deeper things. She had whispered to herbs as she picked them and pressed cymbals into dough before baking. She had poured milk at the edge of the woods each month without ever explaining why. Marit had learned by watching, by copying, and by simply being present. But she had never been told everything, not with words. She sometimes wondered if her mother had intended to tell her more, if she had known time was short, or if she had trusted that Marit would come into the knowing when she was ready. But ready wasn't something Marit felt. Not now. Now she felt watched, not by the trees or the forest, but by her own past, by something circling just outside the reach of the candlelight. A sound broke the quiet. Not loud, not sharp, just a crunch of leaves. One, then another. Not close, but not far either. She stood slowly, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders, the air wrapping cold around her arms. She stepped to the window and tilted her head to the side, listening more than looking. There were no torches, no movement, no clear figure. But someone was out there, not approaching, not fleeing, just present. She placed her hand against the window's edge and let her breath slow. Whoever it was, they weren't afraid. If they were, they'd run. If they were bold, they'd knock. But this was a watcher, someone waiting to see what she would do. She whispered a word then, soft, unfamiliar, but familiar to her mouth. Her mother used to say it when storms gathered far off. She never said what it meant. It was the sort of word that didn't need a meaning, just the breath to carry it. And outside, the leaves stopped moving. The wind stirred again just after the word left her lips, but it moved differently now, no longer sweeping past the cottage as it usually did. Instead, it swirled briefly around the walls, caught between branches and wood, like it was listening. Marit stood still, her hand against the frame, watching for any movement beyond the trees. But whatever presence had crept close was now gone, or had chosen to melt back into the forest, the way fog slips into low places and vanishes. She didn't feel afraid, though her pulse hadn't yet slowed. What she felt was something quieter, not calm, but certainty. Whoever had been out there wasn't there to harm her, not yet. They had come to watch, to listen, maybe to remember. She left the window and returned to the hearth, sitting on the floor with her back against the stone base. The candle's flame leaned slightly in the breeze that had snuck through the cracks in the wood, casting a long, thin shadow along the floorboards. Her eyes followed it absently. She was tired, but sleep wouldn't come. It rarely did anymore, not since her mother's passing. Her dreams had grown restless. Some nights were filled with wandering faces and half-familiar voices, speaking in broken words she didn't recognize. Other nights, there were only sounds, fire, rushing water, the slow creak of old trees bending. The sparrow in its box seemed to hum with a quiet weight behind her. It hadn't made a sound, of course, but its meaning sat heavy in the room. The red thread had been too neatly tied, too precise. It wasn't just a message, it was a marker, a signpost to something old and waiting. She wondered if it was meant to protect or provoke, but that wasn't clear yet. What she did know was that someone else remembered the old ways, or perhaps wanted her to remember more than she had. She hadn't practiced the deeper rites. She hadn't dared. Her mother had been cautious even in her last days, reminding her that knowledge was not safety, and that some understanding comes with a price that doesn't show until it's too late. Outside, an owl called softly from the woods. Then another. For a moment it sounded like a conversation. Marit closed her eyes, listening as the night folded in on itself. The forest had rhythms like breath. She used to think it was her imagination, but the older she got, the more certain she became that the land remembered things. Not in the way people remembered names or stories, but in a slower, deeper sense, like water that always finds its way back to a stream bed, no matter how long it's been blocked. Some places remember people too. They remember wounds, kindness, fear. She had felt it before, beneath her bare feet in spring, under her hands as she dug through frozen soil in winter. Memory wasn't only for the mind. Sometimes it lived in the bones of the world. She stirred finally, rising stiffly and placing another log near the hearth, not to burn, just to have ready. The candle had shortened since she'd lit it, and the wax was beginning to pool unevenly along the base. She didn't light another. There was no need. Darkness was familiar, and she had never been one to fear what couldn't be seen. It was what was half seen, half spoken, that carried weight. Before she returned to her pallet in the corner, she knelt near the small stone jar by the wall, the one that held the last of her mother's ash. Most had been scattered beneath the oldest yew in the grove, just beyond the cottage path, but she had kept a little, not out of superstition, but out of quiet habit. It gave her something to speak to when her voice was too full for silence. She placed her palm gently on the lid and whispered again. Not the same word from earlier. Something softer this time, not a spell, not a chant, just a remembering. As she lay down, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin, her eyes lingered on the ceiling. The rafters creaked now and then, not with fear, but age. The forest would sleep soon too, and she let herself drift with it, her thoughts floating just above the edge of dreaming. Somewhere in the village, a candle went out. Somewhere closer, a twig snapped underfoot. But she didn't rise to check, not this time. Sleep, when it finally came slow and strange, full of whispers that knew her name. Morning came slow, dragging its pale light through the window as though reluctant to enter. Marit woke with a weight behind her eyes, the kind of sleep that doesn't quite restore, but lingers like fog around the edges of thought. Her body ached from the cold, her neck stiff from the way she had curled herself too tightly in the night. She didn't move right away. She simply lay there, staring at the beams above her, watching as thin threads of light caught the drifting dust. The dreams had faded the way they always did, trailing behind her like smoke from a fire she couldn't remember lighting. She tried to hold on to pieces, a voice maybe, a figure at the edge of a grove, something dark with eyes that didn't blink, but it was gone before her feet touched the floor. The fire hadn't burned during the night, but she didn't light one yet. She opened the door instead, letting in the sharp scent of wet leaves and turned earth. Mist still clung low, creeping along the roots and weaving through the brush like it was searching for something. She stood on the threshold for a long moment, bare feet pressed against the cold wood, blankets still draped around her shoulders. The forest was quieter than usual, no birdsong, just the slow rustle of branches shifting above. It reminded her of the pause before a storm, the way animals go silent, and the air tastes of iron. There were no footprints on the path. Whoever had come near the cottage last night had been careful, or perhaps they had walked in ways that didn't leave marks. That wasn't something most would believe, but Marit had learned not to argue with the things that didn't follow rules. She had seen too much of the world's quiet strangeness to pretend it could all be explained away with logic and prayer. Some things just were, and sometimes the land answered questions you hadn't asked aloud. She gathered her things slowly that morning. Her basket with the leather handle worn smooth from years of use, a small knife wrapped in cloth, a folded scrap of linen she'd embroidered with a simple knotwork pattern when she was a girl. She had no specific errand in mind, but her fingers moved with purpose. The forest had changed its rhythm, and she needed to walk inside it. Not for herbs, not for healing, for listening. Sometimes that was the only way to understand what the world was trying to say. The first part of the path was familiar, packed with years of footsteps and the pull of her own memory. She passed the leaning yew tree where the ravens liked to perch, though none sat there now. She crossed the little stream where her mother once taught her to listen for the sound of copper in the water, an old trick for knowing when someone had passed upstream with a bleeding wound. She paused only once at the fallen oak near the stone marker, one of the last remnants of the boundary circle that had long since been forgotten by everyone but her. There at the base of the tree she found another sign. This time it wasn't subtle. A bundle of dried thistle wrapped in black thread and pierced with a single pin. It wasn't a charm, it was a curse, but not meant to harm. It had been left like a question or a dare. Someone was testing what she would do. Whether she would claim what had been left behind in her bloodline or turn away and leave it to rot beneath the roots. Marit didn't touch it. Not yet. She crouched beside it and stared for a long while, her breath making little clouds in the morning air. She recognized the weaving. It was old, older than the village, older than the church, maybe even older than the language they spoke now. Her mother had drawn similar patterns once, not for spells, but to remember, to remind. This was memory too, shaped into threat. She stood slowly and turned back toward the cottage. Her basket remained empty, but something had been gathered all the same. As she neared home, she saw the crow. It sat on her roof beam, watching. It didn't caw, didn't move, just stared with that stillness only birds possess, that ancient, bottomless kind of knowing. She stared back, and in that moment she stopped, pretending this was just a bad season. Something had returned, not from the forest, from her. The crow didn't move when she approached the cottage. It sat there, hunched against the wind, its dark eyes fixed on her like it had been waiting all morning. She slowed her steps but didn't stop. Something about its stillness stirred something old in her chest, something that felt less like fear and more like recognition. There had always been crows near the cottage, but they'd never stayed long. They came with the seasons, called once or twice, and then vanished into the trees. This one had the weight of intention. It wasn't passing through, it was watching. Marit opened the door without looking away from it. Only once she was inside did she release the breath she'd been holding. She let the basket slide from her arm to the floor and rested her forehead against the edge of the doorframe for a moment. The wood was cold beneath her skin, and through it she could feel the faint hum of the wind pressing against the walls. Her thoughts moved in slow spirals. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into something, or that something had stepped into her. The curse beneath the tree, the bird on her roof, the strange watcher in the night. It all felt connected by threads she couldn't yet see, but which she could feel pulling at the edges of her sense. She made tea, though the herbs were poor and thin, just dried nettle and a pinch of something bitter she couldn't quite name. Her mother used to call it wood witch leaf, though no one in the village knew it by that name. It didn't heal anything, not directly, but it calmed the heart when the blood beat too loud. She sipped it slowly, sitting cross-legged near the hearth, watching the candle's flame tremble slightly in the current of unseen draughts. The sparrow's bundle still sat untouched in its box, a quiet reminder of something unspoken waiting to be reckoned with. The hours passed strangely that day. She didn't mark them by the sun, which never fully broke through the clouds, but by the slow shifting of light in the room, the changing texture of the air. The forest outside stayed quiet, the village too. She heard no bells, no shouts, not even the echo of a cartwheel on the path. It was as if the world was holding its breath, or maybe just the part of it that touched her. By late afternoon, the crow was still on the roof beam. She checked once through the window and found it perched the same way, facing her door. It hadn't flown. It hadn't called. and she found herself whispering to it without realizing she was speaking aloud. Not words, just murmurs, like the kind her mother used to offer when she didn't know if prayer or spell was needed. She didn't expect an answer. The bird simply blinked once, slowly, and tilted its head as if considering her. Then it flew. No sound, just a smooth, precise movement into the trees. She watched it until it vanished, then turned back toward her work table. Something had shifted again, though she couldn't explain how. It was a feeling in the pit of her stomach, low and steady. Not fear, not quite. More like the ache that comes just before a storm breaks, an old pressure, a heaviness in the air that speaks of rain and things long buried rising to the surface. She unwrapped the sparrow at last, not because she had found courage, but because ignoring it any longer felt more dangerous than facing it. The thread was still tight. The bird's wings bound neatly against its body, its little head turned slightly, as though it had been laid to rest instead of left as a message. She studied the knots, the way the fibers looped over and under. It wasn't village work. It wasn't even church work. It came from somewhere older, somewhere that understood symbols not as words but as acts. She placed it in a shallow bowl and scattered a few dried sprigs of thyme around it. And then she lit a sliver of beeswax and held it over the bundle until the flame curled toward the thread. She didn't burn it. She just let the smoke rise, thick and fragrant, watching how it moved, watching where it leaned. The smoke didn't rise straight. It curled left, then right, then coiled tightly in a spiral before breaking apart. That was a sign she hadn't seen since she was a child. Her mother had told her once, in a voice soft as linen, that when the smoke spirals inward, the thing you're dealing with isn't from outside, it's coming from within. Marit sat back, slowly, hands resting on her knees. Something was awakening. Not around her, inside her. The scent of the burning thyme lingered long after the flame died down. It threaded through the rafters, soaked into the walls, and rested in the folds of her dress like a quiet memory. Marit sat still for a long time, watching the last curls of smoke disappear into the dim air. The bowl before her held nothing now but ash and thread, and a faint trace of something unseen. She could almost feel it on her skin, like the touch of spider silk brushing against the back of her neck. She closed her eyes and breathed in through her nose, letting the weight of the room settle into her chest. There was no fear in her now, not really. Only awareness, like standing on the edge of a deep pool and feeling the cold air rising from its surface. You don't have to jump, but you know something is down there waiting, and at some point you'll have to meet it. The sky outside had faded to that pale, endless grey that arrives just before dusk. It wasn't truly dark yet, but the day had clearly turned its back. In the village, windows would be shuttered soon, candles lit, doors locked, not just against cold, but against old habits of dread. Marit rose slowly, her joints stiff from sitting too long on the floor. She poured what was left of the tea into the basin and watched it swirl down the drain hole cut into the stone slab. The water carried a slight green tint from the herbs, and for a moment it looked like moss had come alive in the bowl, shifting gently before it disappeared. She opened the door again. This time the wind greeted her with a shiver, low and quiet, brushing against her cheek like breath. The trees stood still but not asleep. There was an alertness in their posture, in the way their branches angled ever so slightly toward the cottage. It wasn't threatening, not yet, but it was watching. That sense she had earlier, the feeling of having stepped into something, was stronger now. She could taste it in the air, feel it hum beneath her feet, like the earth itself was waking from a long slumber. Marit stepped off the stoop and followed the path toward the edge of the grove, not far, just far enough to feel the reach of the forest around her. She didn't carry a lantern. She didn't speak. The world was soft with silence, the kind that exists between the breaths of old things. She moved without purpose, or at least without a purpose she could name. Her feet knew the path even if her thoughts hadn't quite caught up. The old tree stump came into view, the one her mother had once called the listening place. Marit had always thought she was being poetic, but now she wasn't so sure. She sat there, letting the wood press into her, rough and firm, grounding. The forest was thicker here, the light thinner. She didn't close her eyes, but her mind drifted anyway, pulled into the slow rhythm of wind and branch and memory. She remembered how her mother used to hum when she worked, a tune with no words, no clear beginning or end. Just a sound that filled the space between chores. Marit heard it now, not with her ears, but in her chest, echoing softly, like a song that had always been there, waiting. When the vision came, it was quiet, like everything else had been. She didn't fall into it. It came up to meet her. The trees blurred, the sky deepened, and in their place stood a woman, not her mother, but someone like her. Older, taller, hair braided with bone and vine. Her eyes were dark, not cruel, but endless. She didn't speak. She just looked at Marit, then reached out and placed a single hand over her heart. The warmth spread instantly. Not fire, but something deeper. A light beneath the ribs. A memory opening from within. Marit blinked, and the woman was gone. The forest was back, the stump beneath her. But her breath had changed, slower, calmer, and the warmth remained. She stood without knowing why and walked slowly back to her cottage. The world felt different now, not safer, not clearer, but aligned like pieces that had never quite touched, were beginning to fit together. She stepped over her threshold and closed the door behind her. And this time, when the shadows pressed in, she didn't light the candle. She let the dark settle around her, and she listened. The dark inside her cottage wasn't the kind that pressed in with dread. It had a softness to it, like the hush between verses of an old lullaby. Marit didn't need the candle. Her eyes had adjusted, and more importantly, so had her thoughts. She sat near the hearth again, this time without the ache of confusion twisting her chest. The warmth that had spread through her during the vision still lingered beneath her skin, slow and steady, like a second heartbeat. It didn't pulse with urgency. It just remained, anchoring her to something she couldn't yet name, but didn't need to fear. She thought of the woman in the woods, the way she had looked at her, not with pity or warning, but with quiet recognition. That kind of gaze didn't belong to strangers. It had the weight of ancestry, of inheritance. Marit didn't know who she was, not by name, but she knew what she meant. She was part of the line, the thread, the line of women whose wisdom didn't live in books, whose power didn't come from incense or psalms, but from knowing the language of leaves, the rhythm of pain, the ancient dialogue between body and earth. That was the legacy her mother had left behind, not in words but in presence. Outside, the night shifted again. The breeze picked up slightly, making the edges of the window cloth flutter just a little, like breath against skin. The forest was breathing too, it seemed, and each inhale brought with it the faintest crackle of change. The village wouldn't remain silent forever. Fear never did. It coiled and gathered, building weight until it found someone to press against. Marit knew she was that pressure point now. The sparrow had said so, the thistle had confirmed it, and the crow had watched her with eyes that knew what others refused to see. She rose slowly and crossed to the shelf above her work table. From behind a row of dried lavender bundles, she pulled down a thin bundle of cloth tied with red twine. It had been there for years, untouched. Her mother had placed it there the night before she died, saying only that it was not for healing, not for sharing, but for remembering, when remembering became necessary. Marit had left it alone. She hadn't wanted to know what kind of memory was so important. It had to be hidden in plain sight. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she untied the twine. The cloth unrolled with the crisp softness of something folded too long. Inside were three things: a smooth river stone etched with an unfamiliar mark, a tiny coil of dried vines sealed with wax, and a scrap of parchment so thin it seemed ready to fall apart in her hands. She brought it close to the dim light, letting her eyes adjust. There were words there, not many, written in her mother's hand, but in a language Marit had only seen once before, in the margins of a book buried at the back of the church library before Father Theobald arrived. The words weren't meant to be read aloud, that much she understood instinctively. They were meant to be remembered by feel, not sound, a rhythm, not a recitation. She folded the cloth back around its contents and returned it to the shelf, her breath quiet but steady. She didn't need to understand everything at once. That had never been how this worked. Her mother had taught her healing through action, not instruction. She had placed her hands in hers, guided her through rituals not with explanation, but with presence. The knowledge came through doing, through listening. That was what she would do now. Marit moved back toward the hearth and sat again. Not to rest, but to listen. Not to wait, but to receive. The world was changing, and something within her had turned as well. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was stepping forward into whatever this path had become. And as the night grew deeper and the wind picked up its low chant, she whispered the rhythm she had read, not aloud, not with her voice, but within herself. A soft pulse, a remembrance. Outside, something stirred in response. The forest answered her in silence, but not the kind that leaves you empty. This was the old silence, the living kind. The kind that breathes and listens and stretches across time without breaking. After Marit whispered the rhythm into herself, the air in the room had changed. It didn't chill or warm exactly. It steadied, like the cottage had drawn in a long breath and was holding it with her. There was a shared awareness now between her and the walls, between the worn stones of the hearth and the dirt packed beneath the floor. She wasn't alone, not in the way people think of loneliness. She was surrounded by a presence she had always sensed, but never let herself speak to fully. And now that she had, there was no going back to pretending it hadn't been there all along. Outside, the trees didn't rustle, but something shifted in the dark. Not footsteps, not wind, just a settling, like leaves adjusting under weight. She didn't rise. She didn't even turn her head. She had learned enough in one night to understand that some things were not meant to be faced directly, not at first. The old ways had their own kind of rules, and one of them was this: when something stirs that remembers you before you were born, it is best to meet it with stillness, and not with fear. The candle had long since gone out, but she didn't relight it. There was enough light from the hearthstone's last bit of heat to cast a faint orange glow. She let it fade naturally. Her eyes didn't need much now. Her other senses were doing the seeing. Her breath was calm, slow. The rhythm she had read from the parchment echoed within her chest, like a drumbeat not made by hand. She could still feel the warmth from earlier, though it had sunk deeper, like embers buried beneath ash. She wasn't sure how long she sat there. Time no longer passed in minutes or hours, but in feeling. Eventually, the quiet gave way to motion. Not outside, but within her. A memory uncurled from a place she didn't know she had. She saw herself as a child, no more than 7, sitting at her mother's side by the edge of the creek. Her mother had dipped her fingers into the water and drawn a line across Marit's forehead, murmuring something that at the time she had thought was nonsense. But now she knew it had been a name. Not hers. Something older. A name meant to shield, a name meant to bind her to a path she didn't yet understand. She whispered that name now, carefully, quietly, just once. The moment it passed her lips, she felt a shift in the room. The small bowl on the far shelf trembled slightly, not from wind, not from motion, but from memory. The air pressed closer around her shoulders like hands gently laid across her back. She had called something, not from the outside, from within herself, and that something had responded. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite. 3 taps, not hurried, not forceful, just enough to announce presence. Her heart gave a single hard thump, but the rest of her remained still. She rose slowly, quietly, as though waking from a dream. Her steps made no sound on the floor. When she reached the door, she paused. "Who comes?" she asked, voice even. There was no answer at first, just the wind through the trees and the faint creak of the wood shifting. Then a voice, low and unfamiliar, shaped like someone who had not spoken often but knew the weight of words. "Not a stranger," it said. She opened the door. Standing there was an old woman, wrapped in a wool cloak the color of bark, her face weathered like old stone. Her eyes were dark but not unkind, and they met Marit's with the calm of someone who had waited a long time to be seen. "You've opened it," the woman said, more observation than question. Marit nodded once. "I didn't know I had." The woman tilted her head slightly. "You remembered? That's enough for now." She stepped inside without being invited, and Marit didn't stop her. The air shifted again as the door shut softly behind them. No more words passed between them for a time. They simply stood there, 2 figures in the quiet, the space between them filling not with conversation, but with understanding. And in that stillness, Marit felt it fully for the first time. The awakening wasn't just hers, it belonged to something much larger, and it had only just begun. The pouch rested on her work table that night, untouched but never unnoticed. Even in sleep it pulled at her. Not with sound or movement, but with presence, the kind that hums just beneath waking thought. Marit slept lightly, her body curled tight beneath her wool blanket, one hand resting near the hearth's edge as if seeking something steady in the shifting dark. Dreams came and went, their images fleeting and half-formed, whispers on the edge of hearing, figures blurred by mist, and a constant, flickering light that never quite became fire, but always felt close. When she woke, the air in the cottage felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just less forgiving. The wood creaked more deeply underfoot. The stone beneath her water basin had a new crack across it, thin as a hair but sharp beneath her fingers. She lit a small fire and set water to boil, adding crushed fennel and a pinch of salt to wake her stomach. As the steam rose, she let her mind trace the shape of the night before. The old woman's voice lingered in her memory like a thread stretched across a wide room. "They've started speaking your name." That was the part she couldn't shake. The villagers had always needed her, but they had never really trusted her. Not fully. Need and faith are not the same thing. One fades the moment it is no longer useful. She drank her tea slowly, listening to the trees beyond the window. They rustled gently, not with warning, but with weary agreement. They had seen this before. History wasn't made by kings or clergy in places like Elderbrook. It was made by small movements, by glances over shoulders, by hands hesitating over a door latch. A whisper here, a name spoken just once too loudly. That was how fires began, with breath, not flame. By mid-morning, the knock came, not like the one from the night before. This was louder, human, insistent. Marit stood very still in the center of the room, her heart thudding once, then again, each beat like a bell in her chest. She stepped to the door and opened it slowly. It was Father Theobald. He stood with his hands folded before him, dressed in his winter cloak, the edges lined with frayed embroidery that had once been fine. His beard had grown longer since the last time she'd seen him up close. His eyes searched her face with a flat, professional patience, like a man cataloguing herbs, not meeting a woman he had known for most of her life. "Sister Marit," he said, though the word sister rang hollow now. "Might I come in?" She didn't answer right away. She stepped back and let the door remain open. He entered, glancing around the space without comment. His eyes lingered briefly on the work table, on the pouches and jars, the bundles of root and leaf. He nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion that had already hardened in his mind. "I come as a friend," he began, though he kept his distance. "There have been questions. You understand, I'm sure. The people speak, and when people speak, we must listen." Marit didn't speak. She let him fill the silence, as she had learned to do with children frightened by fever. He continued. "There was a woman seen near the edge of the forest last night, not someone from the village. They say she went to your door, and when she left, the dogs wouldn't go near her tracks. They say the wind followed her." Marit raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Theobald's voice lowered just slightly. "You know how stories begin, Marit. How they grow teeth." She looked at him now, really looked. His hands were clean, his eyes were tired. He believed in his duty, in his fear, more than he believed in her. And perhaps that had always been the case. "I've not done harm," she said finally. "Not to anyone. But they are afraid." She nodded once. "Yes, and fear is loud." He stepped toward the door then, but paused. "There will be a meeting tomorrow in the chapel. Names will be spoken. The people will decide. It would be good if you came." She watched him leave without another word. The door closed behind him like a breath held too long. Marit turned back to the table. The pouch waited. She touched it once, just with her fingertips. Not yet, but soon. The light that afternoon felt duller than usual, even for a winter sky. The clouds had thickened without warning, casting the cottage and the surrounding trees into a long, pale hush. Marit stood at the door long after Father Theobald had gone, her fingers lightly touching the latch, her eyes not quite focused on the path he had taken back toward the village. There had been a finality in his tone, though he had spoken with restraint. He had not come to ask, he had come to warn. That was the language men like him used when they wished to claim innocence later. It was not a threat, only an observation, not an accusation, only a concern. He was giving her a chance, or at least the appearance of one, and in doing so ensuring he would not be seen as cruel when the fire was lit. Marit let the door fall shut and stepped back into the warmth. Her hands, though steady, had started to ache. That old ache, the kind that settled in the knuckles when the air grew heavy with frost and fear. She returned to her chair and sat slowly, the wood creaking beneath her weight, the silence settling once more like a shawl across her shoulders. The pouch still sat on the table, small and unassuming, but charged with a presence that reached through the air like a hand waiting to be taken. She did not open it. Instead, she reached for her mother's journal. Not the one with notes on tinctures and fevers. The other one. The one wrapped in hide and stained by years of damp and use, its pages filled with cramped script and winding symbols that danced between language and spell. She opened it carefully, thumbing through pages that smelled of earth and oil and smoke. Her mother's voice rose from the ink, not in sound but in feeling. Here were the recipes that spoke to more than the body. Here were the maps, not of land, but of spirit. She let her eyes fall upon a page near the center, its edges worn thin by time. It was a page she had avoided before, drawn to, but never brave enough to fully study. It held a pattern drawn in circles, layered over one another like ripples in a still pond. Beneath it, a line of writing in the old tongue. She didn't know the meaning of every word, but she knew the shape of it. It was a binding, not to trap, but to connect. A way to remember across distances, to send a piece of thought or memory out into the world where it could touch another. It was a way of speaking when one's voice would not reach. Her mother had called it weaving breath. She copied the pattern slowly on a scrap of linen, her fingers moving with care. Not ritual for its own sake, but because that was how the knowledge lived, through rhythm, through repetition. As she traced the circles, she thought of the villagers, of their silence, their sideways glances, the way they had grown thinner in their visits, more hurried in their thank yous. And now, she imagined, they whispered not just about old cures and quiet kindnesses, but about shadows at windows, about birds that stared too long, about the girl who walked the woods alone and spoke to no one at market. She finished the pattern and folded the linen 3 times. She placed it beneath her pillow, not for sleep, but for dream. Dreams would be needed now. If they were to speak of her, let them do so with words she chose. If they were to summon fear, let them wake also to memory. Evening crept in without ceremony. The forest outside grew quieter still. The animals had tucked into their nests early. The crows had not returned. Marit lit a single candle and watched it burn low, the flame bending slightly, though the air did not stir. When it was nearly out, she stood once more, crossed to the table, and picked up the pouch. It was heavier now, or perhaps her hand had simply grown more aware of its weight. She did not open it. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Let them speak her name. She would not be afraid of hearing it. The night passed in layers. One drifted into another like fog, moving across the moors, silent and slow, cloaking everything in that familiar twilight hush. Marit did not sleep in the usual way. She lay down, yes, and closed her eyes, but what followed felt more like passage than rest. She floated in that space between dream and memory, where time no longer mattered, and the mind did not need to explain itself. She saw faces, not clear, not detailed, but unmistakable in the way they watched her, eyes not of judgment, but recognition. A woman with braids wrapped in thread, a boy whose palms were stained with ash, an old man with smoke curling from his breath as though his lungs had never known anything but fire. None of them spoke, but they stood together, and she knew somehow that they were part of her, not in blood alone, but in what they had carried, what they had chosen. When dawn finally began to stretch its pale fingers over the cottage roof, Marit opened her eyes and knew she would not go to the chapel. The decision had already settled in her bones long before her mind acknowledged it. There was nothing to defend. The truth of who she was did not belong to the village, nor to Father Theobald's gentle interrogations. It belonged to the earth beneath her feet, to the warmth still lingering in the place where the old woman had stood, and to the voice in her heart that had never needed permission to exist. She rose slowly and prepared a broth, not from hunger, but because it felt like something her mother would do on a morning such as this. The herbs she used were simple: onion skin for grounding, wild carrot for clarity, a splash of last autumn's vinegar from the blackberries that had overgrown the southern edge of the grove. She stirred with quiet movements, letting the steam rise and curl into the thatch above her, a fragrant banner unfurling for no one but herself. Outside, the woods remained still, but a new stillness. Not the sleep of night, but the pause before something begins. A hush, not from peace, but from anticipation. She felt it in the wind, which had grown cautious. Even the birds had kept their distance this morning. She didn't blame them. They sensed what most humans had forgotten to feel, that old things were waking. She stepped outside after the broth cooled and placed the bowl on the threshold. Not for herself, not for an offering in the way the church taught, but in the way the land remembered. Food for whatever passed by. For the fox with one ear who sometimes lingered near the woodpile. For the wind if it felt hunger. For the ancestors should they walk again. The trees didn't speak, but she felt them lean toward her ever so slightly. She returned to the table and unwrapped the pouch. Inside was a stone, not large, but smooth and worn at the edges, etched with a spiral similar to the one she had seen in her mother's book, but deeper, cut so cleanly into the surface that it seemed to shimmer despite the dull grey of the rock. Alongside it was a single strand of red hair, tied with black thread and a folded scrap of leather. She opened the leather slowly, revealing a pressed sprig of belladonna, its leaves nearly black with age. A mark was burned into the leather's inner side, a symbol she did not recognize, though something in her chest answered to it with quiet heat. These were tokens. Not charms, not tools. They were pieces of something old, fragments meant to stir what had been kept sleeping. She placed them gently on the table, fingers lingering a moment on the stone. It felt warm, faintly so, pulsing with a life that was not entirely hers. The villagers would be gathering by now, their voices hushed beneath the chapel's vaulted ceiling. Her name might already have been spoken. Or it might be waiting on the lips of someone whose fever she had once broken, whose child she had stitched after a fall. Gratitude is a weak shield against fear. She knew that too well. She looked out the window and whispered nothing. There was no need for words. If they came, they would come. And when they did, she would be ready. Not with fire, but with memory. The day crept by without sound. Marit did not move far from the cottage. She did not draw water or gather herbs. She did not sweep the floor or sort the jars that needed sealing. Those were things for other days, days when routine kept the world in place and purpose lived in the hands. Today was for stillness, for listening. She remained seated at the table, her fingers brushing the stone from the pouch in slow, thoughtless circles. The spiral carved into its surface seemed deeper now, more defined, as though the light itself sank into it. It wasn't magic in the way most people imagined, with sparks and spells and whispered commands. It was memory held in matter, a story told without words. And in the quiet, it spoke to her in its own way. Across the village, voices began to rise in the distance, not shouts, not yet, just the low rumble of people gathering, the scrape of boots on worn chapel steps, the creak of pews as bodies shifted in close quarters. The sound travelled strangely through the trees, carried in pieces like wind slipping through a cracked window. She could hear the bell when it rang, one soft peal to call, another to settle, and then silence. The kind that means mouths are moving and ears are straining, but no one is breathing too loudly. Marit leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes. She did not imagine what they said. She had no need to. These things followed a rhythm as old as hunger. Fear likes a shape. It likes a name. It likes to be pointed like a finger or a blade. Somewhere, someone would mention the sparrow, someone else would speak of the crow. Then the visit from the stranger. The fact that Marit had not come to the meeting would not go unnoted. Silence is often mistaken for guilt, and the silence of a girl who walks alone and speaks to the dead is the kind that wraps around suspicion like ivy on stone. Still, she did not rise. A breeze moved across the cottage roof, soft and uncertain. It rattled the thatch just enough to remind her the world outside still moved, even if her heart now beat to something deeper. She stood eventually, slow and steady, and stepped outside. The forest breathed around her, tall and bare and grey, but not lifeless. There was moss at the edges of the stones, damp and deep green, clinging to the crevices where shadow lingered. A squirrel darted through the underbrush, then paused mid-leap to look at her, holding its breath in a way that mirrored her own. Even the small things knew something old had stirred. She walked a few paces from the threshold, enough to see the eastern edge of the grove. There, the light filtered through in long streaks, gentle and golden, slanting down like fingers reaching for water. She knelt beside one of the boundary stones, flat and half covered in leaf fall. Her mother had told her once that these stones didn't keep people out, they kept memory in. They were not walls, they were wells, places where the past pooled and waited for someone to drink. She placed the spiral stone atop it and pressed her palm lightly over both. The warmth returned instantly, not burning, but alive. It moved through her hand and into her arm, up through her chest and into her breath. She exhaled slowly and felt the air carry something out of her she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The fear of the fire, yes, but something older too, the fear of being the only one who remembered. When she returned to the cottage, the light had changed. The clouds had thickened again, and the breeze had grown teeth. She lit the hearth, more for company than for heat, and stirred what remained of the broth from morning. As it warmed, she laid the leather scrap beside the pouch's other contents, arranging them like pieces in a story only just beginning to make sense. And then came the sound, far off but sharp, not a bell, not a voice, but a knock, not at her door, from the edge of the trees. The knock came again, 3 short raps, then nothing, not a sound from the path, not the rustle of leaves or the crunch of frost, just the fading echo of touch on wood, or something like wood, though her door had not moved. Marit stood by the hearth with the ladle still in her hand, motionless. The broth, forgotten, steamed gently in the pot, sending a ribbon of vapor up toward the rafters. She didn't turn her head immediately, she listened instead, carefully, the way her mother had once taught her to listen when a child's fever climbed beyond what herbs could bring down. "You wait," she had said, "you wait until the air tells you whether to act or to be still." And the air now was thick with pause. She placed the ladle down and stepped to the door. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The knock had not come from there. She moved instead to the narrow side window, the one near the shelf where the drying bundles hung like slumbering bats. The view from there gave her a slice of the eastern grove, the stones, the hollow, where light rarely lingered even at midday. There was nothing but trees, still as prayer. And then a shift. A shadow, thin as thread, moved from behind a trunk. It did not walk, it slipped, the way light does when filtered through moving branches. Marit blinked. Once, twice, it was gone. But something remained, a sound now softer than the knock, a scrape like cloth dragged across bark. Then a breath, deep and low, the kind that does not come from lungs, but from earth. She opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The wind greeted her, sharp and dry, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from somewhere distant. The path ahead was empty, but the forest felt newly full. The boundary stone she had touched earlier now had something resting atop it. Not the spiral stone, she had taken that back inside, but something else. She approached slowly, each step pressing into soil still wet from old rain. It was a feather, long, black and edged with a faint sheen of blue. Not like a crow's, sleeker, finer. She reached down and picked it up. It was warm, not from sunlight. There had been no sun. It held warmth like breath, like something alive had only just left it behind. She turned slowly, expecting, hoping, to see someone watching from the trees. But they remained still. Not empty. Never empty, just holding their silence like a shared secret. Marit tucked the feather into the fold of her apron and returned to the cottage. She closed the door gently behind her and for a moment stood with her back against it, her eyes tracing the lines of the room as though searching for signs of change. But the hearth still glowed, and the broth still steamed, and the quiet still held. She crossed to the table and laid the feather beside the stone and the leather scrap. The three items formed a triangle now, unintentional perhaps, but precise. She looked at them and felt the heaviness in her chest shift. Not ease, exactly, but settle, like a story finding its next sentence. Outside she heard the distant creak of the chapel door closing. The meeting was over. She could imagine how it had gone. Whispers leaned into questions. Questions dipped into fears. Someone asked too loudly where Marit had gone. Someone else spoke of signs, the sparrow, the crow, the strange wind. And finally, someone brave or foolish enough had said it aloud. Witch. And no one had argued. She lit another candle, this one shorter than the last. Its light flickered a little too high before calming into its steady glow. She sat before it and rested her hands on the table. The objects before her did not promise safety. They did not promise power. They simply were. Part of a story older than the chapel's stone, older than the priest's worry, older even than her mother's murmured prayers. The spiral stone, the leather scrap, the feather. Each one called to something, not outward, inward. The knocking had come from the edge. The next would come from within. The candle burned low, casting a quiet golden pool across the table, flickering against the spiral stone and the edge of the leather scrap. The feather's shadow stretched long and narrow across the grain of the wood, as though pointing to something just beyond her reach. Marit sat still, her palms laid flat on the table, her shoulders curved inward, with the quiet weight of knowing. There was a change now. Not in the world outside, though she felt it waiting like breath held behind the trees. The change was inside her. Not sudden, not loud, just a gentle tilting of her thoughts, a shifting of the root system beneath the surface of her life. It was a feeling like remembering something you had never actually forgotten, only misplaced. She let her gaze rest on the spiral stone again. There was something in the shape that called to her, not just as a symbol, but as a path. The center never moved, but the line around it kept winding, leading you back again and again to the thing you had been avoiding. She rose from her seat and pulled the fur shawl across her shoulders, though the cottage was still warm from the hearth. She needed the weight. She needed something to anchor her as she stepped outside once more. The wind had died down again, but the air was thick with the kind of stillness that seems to come before a sound, the pause before the owl calls or the branch gives way under snow. The sky overhead had grown pale, not yet night, but no longer truly day. That in-between hour that had always belonged to her mother. The hour when herbs were tied in bundles and prayers were spoken over boiling pots. Not the kind of prayers you said in a chapel, but the ones said with bare feet and dirt under your nails, words shaped more by breath than by meaning. She followed the narrow path to the eastern edge of the grove, where the stones stood in a long, uneven line, like teeth half buried in the soil. She paused at the one where she had found the feather, her eyes scanning the ground, though she wasn't sure what she was looking for. There was no sound, no breeze, no birds, just the soft hum of her own blood in her ears and the strange rhythm her heart had begun to follow, slow and steady, like footsteps measured out across generations. Then she saw it, a mark on the bark of the nearest tree, a shallow carving, clean-edged and fresh, not made by a blade, something older, sharper. The same spiral etched into the stone, but reversed, as though mirrored. She raised her fingers to touch it, but stopped just short. There was heat in the air near it, faint and steady, like standing near the hearth when it has burned low. She did not need to understand what it meant. She only needed to answer. Marit knelt before the stone and closed her eyes. She pressed both palms flat to the ground and breathed in deep, letting the smell of moss and cold earth fill her. Her fingers curled slightly, finding the ridges of roots and the smoothness of old fallen leaves. She whispered nothing. Just let her body become still, her breath become part of the place. And from that stillness something rose, not a sound, not a voice, but a pull. It came from below, not deep, but old, like water rising through stone. She did not resist. She let it move through her, into her, until her hands tingled and her chest felt hollow and full all at once. And then came the image, not of fire, but of hands. Dozens, reaching not to take but to guide. Women, always women. Their faces veiled in shadow, but their palms warm, open. She felt their presence the way one feels the sun behind clouds, unseen but certain. She opened her eyes. The spiral carved into the tree glowed faintly now, just for a moment, like a coal stirred beneath ash. And then it dimmed. She rose, slowly, and returned to the cottage. The hearth was still glowing. The broth had not boiled dry. The candles still burned, but everything had changed. She no longer waited for them to come. She was preparing to meet them. That night, the village could not sleep. Even though the chapel meeting had ended hours earlier, and the decision, though unspoken aloud, had already taken shape in the minds of most who gathered, there was an unrest in the air that no pronouncement could soothe. Mothers lingered at the bedsides of their children longer than usual, brushing damp hair from brows even when there was no fever. Old men sat in silence beside their hearths, stirring the ashes long after the fire had gone out. And outside, in corners where the lantern light didn't reach, the wind picked up again, soft but persistent, rustling leaves that had not moved in weeks. The dogs whined without barking. The crows did not call. Only the church bell remained quiet, though its rope swayed slightly in the breeze, creaking now and again like an old man's sigh. In her cottage at the edge of the forest, Marit sat before the hearth, the spiral stone in her hand. She had not slept since returning from the grove. There was no need. Her body felt neither tired nor restless. It existed in that strange stillness that came after mourning, but before grief, when you have already said goodbye to the world. You knew, but have not yet greeted the one that is coming. She had placed the feather beside her candle and tucked the leather scrap beneath the floorboard where her mother's book was hidden. The stone remained with her, warm against her palm, as if it pulsed with the slow breath of something buried deep. She thought of the villagers then. Their faces were no longer clear in her memory. They blurred together now, rows of eyes that watched too closely when she passed, mouths that smiled too quickly and then looked away. She remembered the woman with the twisted ankle, the boy with the frost-bitten fingers, the couple whose child had not drawn breath until Marit's hands had touched the mother's belly in silence. None of them had returned in the last week. No one came now unless they were sent. And even those sent by desperation lingered no longer than needed. The change was not sudden, it never was. Fear, like frost, crept in unnoticed. It arrived not with rage, but with suggestion. It made people doubt what they once knew to be true, and when it grew too heavy, it disguised itself as justice. She stood and stepped out into the night. The cold met her gently, not with bite, but with stillness. The stars were faint behind a thin veil of cloud, and the moon, just past half, hung low over the treetops, distant and unreadable. She walked without hurry, her feet bare against the packed soil, feeling each stone and twig as though her body were waking to the ground's memory. The path to the edge of the forest had changed since dusk. Not in shape, but in presence. The air was thicker now, not with smoke or mist, but with story. She could feel it brushing against her arms, nudging her forward. At the boundary stone where the feather had been left, she paused. The spiral on the bark remained, faded now, but still faintly warm. She rested her hand against it and closed her eyes. No visions came this time, no dream faces, just the sense of something waiting, patient and wide, like water beneath ice, deep and still but always moving. She stood there for a long while, her breath soft in the cold. Then she turned toward the village. The lights of Elderbrook shimmered in the distance, not bright, but constant. Windows glowed like watchful eyes. She imagined the chapel again, empty now, but thick with the echoes of whispered names. She wondered who had spoken hers first, whether it had come from kindness or from fear, whether it mattered. She returned to the cottage and stoked the fire. It caught easily, rising with a steady flame that made no sound. She sat once more and picked up the stone. It was time to use it. Not as a weapon, not as a shield, but as a key. Because the knock that would come next would not be from the village. It would be from whatever came before it. The firelight flickered gently, casting shadows that danced across the beams of the ceiling. Marit sat motionless at the edge of the hearth, the spiral stone cupped in both hands as though it were something living, something tender enough to be cradled rather than wielded. Her breath was quiet, but her chest felt full, as if she carried a wind inside her that had yet to be exhaled. The cottage, so familiar in its angles and creaks, no longer felt like just her home. It had become a vessel, a hollowed-out space meant for passage, for transformation, for the meeting of past and present in one still breath. The stone warmed beneath her palms again, but differently this time, not just with the faint, pulsing heat she had come to know over the last days, but with a steady glow that settled beneath her skin and hummed up through her bones. It was not pain, it was not comfort, it was recognition. As if the stone itself remembered her, not just as Marit, but as something older, a thread in a longer weave. Without quite knowing how she decided, she rose to her feet. She moved to the center of the room and knelt there, placing the stone gently on the packed earth floor. Then, almost without thought, she pressed her palms beside it, flat to the cold ground. The earth answered, not with words, not with sound, but with sensation rising through her hands and into her ribs, filling her with the sense of 1,000 footsteps that had passed this same spot, in other winters, in other lives. The whispers returned too, soft and fragmented like breath through reeds, names she did not know, songs she had never heard, yet somehow remembered the endings too. Her mother had never taught her this part. It could not be taught. It had to be remembered. Slowly, as if guided by something just outside her sight, Marit began to trace the spiral from the stone into the dirt with her fingertip. The soil gave way easily, the mark forming cleanly in its wake. Around and around she moved, expanding the shape, drawing it wide across the floor in one unbroken line. With each turn, her breath grew steadier, deeper, her body falling into rhythm with the shape she drew. By the time the final circle was formed, the spiral stretched nearly wall to wall, wrapping the hearth in its curve like a quiet embrace. She sat back on her heels and waited. For a time, there was nothing. Just the fire, the shadows, the steady thrum of her own heartbeat. Then the light shifted. Not the firelight. That still flickered as before. But something beyond it. A dimming, a deepening of the space around her, as though the walls had softened or stepped aside. The air changed too. It thickened with scent, earthy like wet bark and crushed pine needles, touched with the sharp edge of something bitter and sweet, like clove, soaked in root wine. And then came the voice. It didn't speak words, it didn't come from the air. It rose inside her like a memory she had never owned, deep and low, a hum more than a phrase. It moved through her like a river under thawing ice. She felt her body sway with it, her head bowing forward without her willing it. The voice did not ask questions. It did not offer answers. It only revealed. She saw her grandmother then, not the one who raised her mother, but the one before. Hair dark as ash, eyes that bore straight through fog. She stood beside the grove's heart, hands stained with berry and blood. She was not smiling. She was watching, waiting, and behind her a dozen others, none with faces clear enough to name, but all bearing the same eyes, Marit's eyes. Each of them held something, a tool, a herb, a bone, a stone, and each of them laid it down into the spiral at their feet. Marit blinked, and the vision faded like breath on glass. The spiral on the floor still glowed faintly. But now, in the stillness, she knew. The next knock would not ask for her name, it would call her by it. The warmth from the spiral lingered on her skin long after the vision faded. It had not been a dream. That much Marit knew, without needing to question it. Dreams drifted away in pieces, fragile and unsure, slipping between waking and memory. But this had entered her like something spoken aloud, like a bell rung once and still echoing inside her ribs. She sat quietly in the center of the spiral, her legs folded beneath her, the firelight now only a faint glow at the edge of her vision. The candle had gone out. Or perhaps she had forgotten to light another. Time no longer kept its usual shape. The room around her hadn't moved, but it no longer felt like the same room. The walls were where they had always been, yet the space they held had stretched somehow not in size, but in presence. She felt surrounded not by furniture or shadow, but by waiting. Her fingers still tingled. Her spine held a steady hum. The ground beneath her felt awake, the way a forest feels just before rain. She looked down at the spiral she had traced into the dirt, now softly aglow with the last of whatever breath had passed through it. The light pulsed once, then settled like a heartbeat, slowing after a long run. She placed her hands in her lap and breathed in slow and deep, tasting smoke and salt and pine. Then came the knock, not loud, not rushed, a single knock, firm, final, not from the door, not from the trees, from beneath. The sound rose up through the floorboards just to her left, a knock like skin to wood, like knuckle on stone. Marit did not move, not from fear, not from awe. She simply waited. Another knock came, softer, lower. This time not through the boards, but from the wall nearest the hearth, and then another behind her, one after the next, 4 knocks, 4 corners, as if the very foundation of the cottage had joined the conversation. She stood then slowly, the spiral now beneath her feet, soft and humming, no longer glowing but very much alive. She walked to the hearth and knelt, brushing aside the cold ash at its base. The floor here was stone, not earth. Her mother had always said the hearth was older than the cottage, built upon something deeper. A stone laid not by masons but by hands that remembered different kinds of warmth. Marit placed her palm flat against the slab, and the moment her skin touched it, the knocking ceased. Silence returned, not the silence of absence, but the kind that follows a name being called, the kind that waits to see who answers. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her answer had already been given, not in words, but in her willingness to remain, in her refusal to run, in the way she had traced the spiral and placed the stone and listened. The fire behind her shifted, its embers crackling with soft urgency. A gust of wind pushed through the window slats, carrying the scent of something unfamiliar, sour and sweet, like cider gone to rot and bloom all at once. She turned toward it, eyes scanning the dark. Outside, the wind picked up, this time not just as breeze, but as movement. Leaves lifted from the forest floor and swirled against the outer walls. Somewhere in the trees, something called out. Not an owl, not a fox, a sound that did not belong to any creature she knew. Low and stretched, like a song sung backward, like language that had forgotten itself. Marit stood at the door, hand resting on the latch. She didn't open it. Not yet. Behind her, the feather on the table quivered without being touched. The stone no longer pulsed, but the warmth it had given remained in the air like a held breath. They were near now, not the villagers, not yet, but the ones from the spiral, the ones who knocked from within. And this time they had not come to show her. They had come to see if she would lead. She did not open the door. Marit stood with one hand resting on the wooden latch, fingers loose but ready, the silence of the room drawing itself tight around her like thread, pulled through cloth. The knock had not come again, but something hung in the air, expectant and still, like a question waiting not for an answer, but for recognition. She could feel them just beyond the wood, just past the veil of bark and root and fog. They did not move like men, they did not breathe like deer. Their presence was quieter than shadow, but it filled the world all the same. The spiral she had drawn on the floor no longer glowed, but its mark remained soft in the dirt, still warm beneath her bare feet. It pulsed, not with light, but with memory now, each ring a reminder, each curve a tether. The cottage had become more than home. It was a gate, not between the living and the dead, but between forgetting and remembrance, between what the village feared and what the forest never forgot. She turned from the door and crossed back to the hearth. The air shifted as she walked, the edges of the room pulling closer, not to trap her, but to hold her in place, like roots cradling the base of a tree. She bent down again beside the old hearthstone and placed both palms upon it. The warmth there had changed. It no longer whispered of embers or coals. It beat steadily, like a heart hidden deep in the soil, and she found herself breathing in time with it, slow and even, her chest rising like the rhythm of tide against shore. In her mind, the faces from the spiral returned, not visions this time, not flickers or ghosts, impressions, presences, the woman with braids, the boy with ash-stained hands, the man whose breath curled into smoke. They surrounded her in thought alone, and yet she could feel their closeness the way one feels the nearness of thunder before it sounds. They did not speak in words, but their presence asked her the only question that mattered now. Would she take her place? Marit did not weep. There was no sorrow in the moment, only gravity. The kind that comes with choosing to be seen, not for the safety of masks, but in the shape your bones had always known. She rose and stepped into the spiral again, this time not to sit or trace, but to stand, still and full. She lifted the stone from where she had placed it earlier and held it high enough that the firelight caught the spiral edge. It shimmered faintly, then dimmed, as if accepting the end of its task. Then the wind outside shifted again. This time it came not in swirls or gusts, but in rhythm, a cadence, a step, a procession without feet. She turned toward the door and did not flinch as it creaked open, slow and silent, the latch lifting without her touch. They stood at the edge of the threshold, not many, 3 perhaps. Or maybe more, it was hard to say. Their shapes were cloaked in something older than darkness, the kind of veil that doesn't hide, but reminds you that looking too hard can unravel the very thing you're trying to see. They didn't come forward, they waited. Marit stepped to the doorway and did not cross it. She bowed her head slightly, not in deference, but in recognition, and then she whispered a name. Not her own, but the first one. The one passed down through marrow and dream. The name her mother had never dared to say aloud. The name her grandmother had once carved into the bark of an alder tree near the deepest spring. She said it once. The wind stopped. The figures at the door bowed slightly, then turned back toward the trees, and Marit followed. Not as a girl hunted, not as a healer hiding in the woods, but as something returning, something remembered. The night held her gently as she stepped into it, the chill air closing softly around her shoulders like a shawl long forgotten and suddenly remembered. The figures who had come to her door did not speak, nor did they lead in the way of guides. They moved as if they knew she already carried the path within her, and so she followed not by step alone, but by memory that lived in marrow and shadow. Her bare feet touched the damp forest floor without flinching, the cold softened by the hum that now stirred in her chest. The ground beneath her was no longer just root and soil, it was story, and it remembered her tread. The forest itself had changed, though nothing had shifted visibly. The trees were still tall and thin, rising like old bones in the dark, their branches arching above like the ribs of a cathedral. But the space between them was different now, deeper, broader. The distance stretched and curled, folding time into itself, so that each step felt both immediate and endless. The air was thick with pine and ash, and a faint sweetness she could not name. There was no moon, but a pale silver light flickered here and there, not from above, but from the ground, tiny glows at the base of trunks, caught in the curve of leaves, as though the forest had lit its own lanterns in quiet welcome. They walked for what felt like a long time, though the cottage still flickered faintly behind them, its door open, the fire inside glowing warm and red like a waiting heart. Marit didn't look back. She didn't need to. The cottage had done its work. It had kept her safe, cradled her growing, and held her doubt until it had ripened into something else. What she was walking toward now was not safety nor danger, but truth. At last, the figures slowed. They stepped aside, parting like mist before her, revealing a clearing she had never seen but had somehow always known. It was not large, barely a ring wide enough to hold 10 steps in any direction. At its center stood a single stone, upright and worn, its top covered in lichen, its sides carved with lines that twisted and coiled and met in the familiar spiral. Around it, the trees bent slightly inward, as if listening. The soil here was soft and dark, the air heavier still. Marit stepped forward into the clearing and felt the hum in her chest grow louder, more certain. The stone called to her, not like a voice, but like a pull behind the ribs, deep and low and kind. She walked to it slowly, her steps measured not by fear, but by reverence. The figures stayed behind. Their presence remained, but they no longer led. This part was hers alone. She knelt before the stone and placed her hand upon it. The surface was cold, but not lifeless. The spiral cut into its front pulsed faintly, as if recognizing the touch. She closed her eyes and let the silence wrap around her. And into that stillness something began to rise. It wasn't a vision, not like the ones before. It was sensation. Memory passing through body. She felt herself as a girl, younger than now, pressing herbs into her mother's palm. Then, as a woman she had never been, kneeling in this very clearing with a broken comb tied in her braid. Then again, older still, eyes clouded with age, but heart clear as dawn, whispering a name into stone. The spiral was not a symbol. It was a door, and she was opening it now. She spoke softly, not in any tongue she remembered learning, but in sounds that came naturally, shaped by the rhythm of breath and wind. The clearing listened, the stone listened, and far beneath her the ground itself stirred, not violently, but like something waking slowly from centuries of sleep. Then the figures behind her knelt, all of them, together, as one. She did not turn, she simply stood and placed both hands on the stone. And the forest exhaled. The forest exhaled not with a gust, not with a howl, but with a soft loosening. A breath returned to the world after being held too long in the lungs. The leaves on the ground stirred gently around the clearing's edge, rustling not from wind, but from something older than air. Marit stood at the stone, her palms flat against its cold, weathered face, the spiral beneath her fingers now glowing dimly, like coal buried deep in the ash that has not yet gone cold. Her eyes were closed, but she did not need to see. The stone did not demand sight. It required only presence, and she had offered that without hesitation. The figures behind her remained kneeling, their shapes quiet and undefined, yet unmistakably real. They did not shift or murmur, they simply knelt, as if anchoring her with their stillness. She could feel the weight of their faith in her, though they had not spoken a word. They trusted not because they had chosen her, but because she had chosen to remember. That choice had called them, and now it was calling something else. From the base of the stone, a light began to stretch outward. It moved slowly, crawling across the ground like liquid moonlight, tracing the edges of the clearing and curling into another spiral, larger, encompassing all who knelt there. As the lines formed, Marit felt a pull in her chest, Not painful, not frightening, just strong, like the tug of tide returning to sea. She inhaled and felt the memory of countless hands layered over her own. Women's hands, calloused and scarred, steady and patient, planting, stitching, healing, mourning. Her mouth began to move again. Words, sounds, syllables she had never read, never heard, came forth in a murmur shaped by instinct. Each one landed softly, but the air responded. The trees leaned just slightly inward, and the ground beneath her feet grew warmer, as if the forest itself had begun to gather around her. And then the spiral glowed brighter, not blinding, not sharp, but whole. A full glow, like the face of a lantern burning evenly in deep night. Marit opened her eyes. The stone before her had changed. The carvings were no longer just patterns. They had deepened, grown more intricate. Faces now emerged from the hash lines, each formed by curves and hollows of the spiral itself. Eyes that did not blink, but watched. Mouths closed, not in silence, but in waiting. This was not a shrine, it was a ledger, and it had begun recording again. Marit stepped back and placed the stone from her cottage, the small spiral one, into a hollow at the base of the larger stone. It slid in as if it had always belonged there, and when it settled, the light around the clearing stilled. The air became heavy with calm. A voice, low and distant, rose from behind her, not from any of the kneeling figures, but from the forest itself. It was not speech, it was story, a tale passed not in sentences but in rhythm, the rhythm of footsteps between trees, of breath drawn before giving birth, of a lullaby sung to bones and ash. The spiral was telling her something, not what would happen, not what she must do, but what she now carried. She turned slowly to face the figures behind her. Their faces remained hidden, blurred as if wrapped in mist. But each one raised a hand now, not in farewell, in blessing. Then, like mist before sun, they began to thin, to dissolve. One by one, gently and without fear, they faded into the trees. She stood alone in the clearing, but not empty. The spiral on the ground still glowed, now faint, now resting. The stone remained, its carvings deeper, more alive. She had not been chosen, she had remembered, and the remembering was enough. Marit remained standing in the clearing long after the last of the figures had faded. She felt no fear in their leaving, no abandonment in the silence they left behind. Their absence was not emptiness, but invitation. The spiral had closed around her, not to trap, but to seal, and now the hum in her bones no longer vibrated outward. It pulsed inward, quietly, like breath that settled in the chest after a long walk uphill. The clearing itself had calmed. The wind, which had held such sharp rhythm only moments before, had softened into stillness again. Even the trees had returned to their ancient poses, tall and thin, watching but unreadable. She stepped out of the spiral and paused at the edge of the ring, her gaze lingering on the stone one final time. The carvings still held their quiet glow, the spiral still gently breathing in the grooves, but it was done now. What needed to open had opened. What needed to remember had remembered. She touched the stone one last time, just with her fingertips, and whispered a word that had no shape in her mind. It left her mouth like steam from broth, soft and brief, and the stone received it without echo. As she turned back toward the path, the forest changed once more. It no longer pulled or pressed, it no longer opened for her. It simply existed now, returned to itself. The glow along the trail had gone, and what remained was dark earth and familiar bark and the faint silver wash of the sky above. She walked slowly. There was no urgency. Each step was sure, placed as if the very souls of her feet had grown roots and knew the way without asking. The night air touched her cheeks like a quiet friend, and the smell of damp leaf and pine sap kept her senses close to the ground. When her cottage came into view again, its single window still throwing out a pale orange light, she stopped. Something had changed here too, not visibly. The door still hung slightly crooked on its frame. The herbs still swayed gently where they had been strung along the eaves, but there was a feeling in the air like the space had shifted while she was gone, like the room inside had rearranged itself to fit the shape of who she now was. She stepped through the open door and stood just inside the threshold. The fire had dimmed to a low, steady glow. The spiral on the floor, drawn earlier that evening, had gone dark, but the imprint remained, faint but sure, etched like the lines on a palm. She let her shawl fall from her shoulders and moved to the table, placing her hands on the wood. It was smooth beneath her touch, cool but familiar. The feather still rested in its place. The leather scrap remained tucked into the edge of the shelf. Now, just an object once more, no longer carrying the heat of unspoken things. For a long while, she stood in silence. She had thought she might feel different, visibly so. That the world would feel sharper, or that her breath would taste of power. But what she felt now was not change. It was restoration. She had not become something new. She had returned to something old, something true. The villagers would come. Perhaps not tonight, perhaps not tomorrow. But soon, the chapel bell would toll again. The priest would speak words that sounded heavy with concern. The firewood would be stacked higher. The rumors would harden into decisions. But now she knew what they did not. She knew the forest. And it had answered. She sat beside the hearth and picked up the spiral stone once more. It no longer pulsed in her hand. It simply rested there, cool and still, like a tool that had done its work and was content to wait. And Marit waited with it. Not hiding, not preparing, just ready. Morning arrived without brightness. The sun crept up behind a blanket of grey, offering no warmth, only the faintest light to lift the darkness from the path. The village of Elderbrook stirred slowly. Carts creaked, chickens murmured beneath coop rafters, and boots tapped across the frozen ground. But there was something missing in the usual rhythm of waking. Laughter did not rise from the bakery stoop, nor did the blacksmith sing as he set his bellows to work. Doors opened cautiously. Eyes flicked toward the forest more often than toward the chapel. And in the square, whispers clung to corners like frost that would not melt. Marit remained in her cottage. She did not sleep, nor did she pace. She sat beside the hearth with the spiral stone resting in her lap, her fingers wrapped gently around its edges. The fire had dwindled, but she let it. She welcomed the coolness that crept in. It made the weight of the stone more honest in her hands. She listened, not for footsteps, not for knocking, but for the quiet between sounds. That was where truth often waited. In the silence no one else paid mind to. Somewhere around mid-morning the first sound came, not a knock, not a voice, but a cough. Rough, ragged, coming from the trees beyond the path. It stopped, then came again. Then a voice, low and hoarse, called out, not for her by name, but for help. A plea, uncertain and thin. Marit stood and stepped to the door, opening it just wide enough to peer out. A man stood at the edge of the woods, leaning heavily against a walking stick. His face was pale, his cheeks flushed. In that way fevers often burn hot and hollow. He did not move toward her. He only waited, breath sharp in the cold. She said nothing, she didn't need to. Her gaze held steady, and after a pause, she nodded once. He limped forward slowly, one uneven step at a time, until he reached her threshold. Marit helped him inside, guided him gently toward the bench near the hearth, and laid a folded cloth beneath his legs. She fetched water, not hurried, not frantic, but with the steady hands of someone who had done this 100 times before. The man did not speak again. He just watched her with wide, tired eyes, as though trying to memorize the shape of someone he had feared and now needed. She crushed a root and warmed the water, adding herbs one at a time. The room filled with the scent of sharp mint and bitter bark. She touched his forehead with the back of her hand, then his chest. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "You waited too long," she said. There was no scolding in her tone, just truth. He gave a soft cough of agreement. She fed him the tincture slowly, drop by drop, her fingers steady beneath the cup. As she worked, the spiral stone sat on the table nearby, its presence no longer commanding, but still felt. The man's eyes flicked to it once, then back to her. He didn't ask, and she didn't offer. By the time the sun had risen fully behind the clouds, the worst of his shaking had slowed. He leaned back against the wall and let his breath steady. Marit rinsed the cloth, wrung it dry, and placed it on his chest. "You'll need rest," she said, and stood. He reached for her wrist lightly, fingers trembling. "They'll come," he said. She met his gaze. "They always do. But they won't listen." "I'm not asking them to." She moved back to the hearth and stirred the embers until they caught again. The warmth returned slowly, crackling softly, and the scent of herbs thickened. The man drifted into sleep soon after, his breathing slower, steadier. Outside, snow began to fall, light, soft, almost playful. Inside, the spiral waited, not in stone, but in her. The snow didn't stop by midday. It came gently at first, with flakes the size of lace petals, floating in slow, spiraling dances down to the ground. But as the hours passed, the air thickened and the flakes fell faster, weaving the trees and rooftops into soft white shapes, erasing paths and corners, blurring the lines between one thing and another. Even the sounds changed. The crunch of boots was muffled. The rustle of branches was hushed beneath the soft weight. The world seemed to hold its breath under that snowy hush, as if waiting for something to declare itself. Marit watched from the window, her breath fogging the glass. The man still slept on the bench, curled like a child, his hand resting just beside the cloth she'd left folded across his chest. He hadn't stirred since his eyes had closed, but his breathing had grown deep and even. The red flush in his cheeks softened now to something closer to health than fever. His body, like the fire, had caught just enough to hold on. She had done what she could. The rest would depend on whether he chose to live. Her fingers brushed the wooden sill. Cold seeped through the panes, but she didn't mind. She welcomed it. It kept her sharp, awake. The day had been long already, though the sky still held the pale grey of early afternoon. Something inside her had been counting heartbeats, not hers, not the man's, but something slower and deeper. The kind of counting that comes before thunder, the kind that knows footsteps will follow. She turned away from the window and gathered the dried roots she had set aside earlier. Fever bark, valerian, a sprig of wormwood, brittle as old bones. She ground them in the mortar with even strokes, her hands steady, her thoughts still. It was not just medicine she was preparing. It was memory in physical form, ritual bound to purpose. The act itself settled her mind, the repetition giving her breath rhythm again. She did not rush. Nothing about her moved with panic now. When she heard the second knock, it was not unexpected. This one came from the door, not from beneath, not from the trees, from men, from boots on packed snow, From knuckles on wood, Marit did not answer right away. She finished what she was doing, brushing the crushed herbs into a folded cloth and tying the edges with thin string. She placed the bundle beside the fire, poured water into the kettle, and set it over the flame. Only then did she step to the door. The knock came again, this time a little harder. She opened it. 3 figures stood outside, 2 men from the village, both familiar in the vague way that most townsfolk were. The third was the priest. He did not wear his ceremonial robes, but his collar was stiff, and the iron chain around his neck caught the light. His eyes, like always, were sharp, but unreadable. He looked past her shoulder before he spoke, his voice low, but firm. "We've heard he's here." Marit did not flinch. "He came of his own accord." The priest's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "And yet here he lies, in your keeping. He was dying." "So you say?" He folded his hands in front of him. "There are rules." She stepped fully into the doorway, one hand on the frame. "No rule forbids kindness." The wind picked up then, swirling snow around their feet. The 2 men shifted, not from cold but from discomfort. One of them, younger, looked away. The priest's voice softened, which somehow made it worse. "You've always known there are other kinds of kindness, child. The dangerous sort." Marit's gaze did not waver. "Then perhaps it's the rules that are wrong." A pause hung between them, thick as wool. Finally, the priest gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of recognition. "We'll return," he said, "and not alone." He turned without waiting for her reply. The others followed. Marit watched until they disappeared into the trees. Then she closed the door and bolted it. The bolt slid into place with a soft, final clunk, its sound barely louder than the crackle of the fire or the whisper of snow at the window. It was not a dramatic gesture. There was no flurry of movement or clatter of fear, just a simple motion done without trembling hands, as one might close a book before rising from a chair. Marit stood at the door for a moment longer, her back straight, her eyes resting on the wood grain, as if the priest's shadow still lingered there. But there was no weight in her chest, no panic flooding her limbs. What had come had been expected, and what would follow had already begun long before any knock at the door. She stepped back into the room and gathered more wood for the fire. The man on the bench still slept, though his brow had begun to bead with the first sweat of healing. His breathing had steadied into the low, steady rhythm of recovery. She laid another blanket across him and watched the slow rise and fall of his chest for a moment. It felt right to witness it. Life, after all, was something worth seeing while it still hummed quietly inside the bones. Outside, the snow was heavier now. The sky had deepened into a dim slate, and the world beyond the trees no longer had edges, just shapes fading into softer shapes. The chapel bell did not ring. The village lay low, crouched under its own silence, watching its own breath, and the forest, in its hush, did not stir. Marit moved back to her work. There were bundles to prepare. Not for fleeing, she would not run, but for anchoring, for steadiness, for whatever came through the trees next, whether voice or fire or both. She pulled down a jar of ash root, another of dried marigold, and the last of the waxy black seeds that her mother had kept hidden in a carved-out gourd. These were not charms. These were memory, sealed in plant and dust, and they held no threat unless one meant to strike first. She mixed them slowly in a small clay bowl, adding only a few drops of boiled water, just enough to draw out the scent. The aroma that rose was earthy and strange, not sweet, not sour. something between bark and wind and rain that has touched bone. The mixture would do little in a fight, but it would make them see. That was what mattered. She placed the bowl near the hearth and turned back toward the table. The spiral stone still rested there, cool now, almost ordinary. But she felt its weight even from across the room, not in her hand, but in the quiet way it had stitched itself into her life. It no longer needed to glow. It had already passed something into her that could not be put down. By twilight, the man stirred. His eyes blinked open, red-rimmed but clearer. He tried to rise, but she was beside him before he could manage it. "Not yet," she said gently, placing a hand to his shoulder. His mouth opened, cracked and dry, and for a moment no words came. Then he rasped, "They will come." "I know," she replied, "but you won't be here when they do." Confusion clouded his face, but he did not argue. She helped him sit up slowly, wrapped in wool and steadiness. She poured broth into a cup and brought it to his lips. He drank in silence. And then, softly, she took a pouch from the mantel, an old one, leather worn smooth, stitched long ago by hands smaller than hers, and she filled it with roots, with herbs, with bits of what had saved him. "You'll leave before the moon is high," she said. He nodded. "Where?" "Downstream. There's a woman in the hollow past the bend. She remembers. She will take you in." He closed his eyes, tears gathering. But she did not offer comfort, only direction. As night fell, he slept once more, and Marit waited, not for them, but for the moment the snow would still, and the forest would answer again. The moon did not rise clean that night. It lingered behind a veil of drifting clouds, its light pushing dimly through like a memory trying to surface from beneath layers of silence. The snow fell more slowly now, finer, gentler, the kind that glitters faintly on the shoulders of dark trees and piles like sugar along window sills. The fire in Marit's hearth whispered with the soft rhythm of rest, its flames low but sure, casting long shadows across the walls that moved like old dreams walking the edge of sleep. The man on the bench stirred occasionally, never waking fully, just shifting beneath his blankets with the soft sighs of someone making peace with being alive. Marit moved through the cottage as one might walk through a place of worship. Each step measured, each gesture purposeful. She no longer felt like a girl. She no longer felt like the healer the villagers had once tolerated out of need and suspicion in equal measure. What had passed through her hands, through her voice, through her breath in the clearing, had done something quiet but permanent. It had taken what she was always meant to be and brought it forward, like a candle drawn out from deep within a cave. She did not feel power, she felt weight, not a burden but a grounding, a sense of being placed exactly where the earth had meant her to stand. She knelt beside the fire and stirred the mixture again. It had cooled now, thickened slightly, its scent rising in waves that curled against the stone and wood like fingers. She dipped her fingers into it and pressed a smear across the doorframe, then another over the lintel, her motions steady. Not to keep anything out, not really. Those who feared her would come regardless. But the old markings reminded the house what it was. A place of remembering. A vessel, not for shelter, but for story. That was what needed protecting now. Outside there were no footsteps yet, no flicker of torchlight, just the silence of the forest thickening like breath in cold lungs. Marit returned to the bench and knelt beside the man once more. He was awake this time, eyes glassy but aware. "It's time," she said. He struggled upright, the effort making his breath quicken, but she steadied him, wrapping the pouch of roots into his coat, guiding his hands toward the walking stick she had carved down to his height. He did not speak. There were no more words needed. He understood now what had been given, and what must now be carried. She opened the back door, the one that led not to the path, but through the thin grove of birches where the undergrowth grew low, and the deer passed quiet at dawn. She helped him out into the snow, the silence holding them like arms. Then she watched as he moved slowly into the white, his figure becoming one more shadow among many, until he vanished into the hush. When she closed the door, the wind sighed against it, almost like an exhale. She stood there for a long moment, hand still on the wood, the cold settling around her wrists. Then slowly she turned and faced the room. There was nothing left to do. Everything had been prepared. She sat before the hearth and waited. They came just past the fall of full dark. It began with the low murmur of voices in the distance, too far to make out, carried on the breath of the forest like smoke drifting from a far-off fire. Then the sound of feet, many feet, muffled in the snow. The priest did not come alone. That much had always been certain. Fear is loud when it believes itself righteous. It gathers others not by reason, but by echo. She heard the jangle of iron and the wooden groan of a cart, the scrape of a torch pole against branch, the cough of a man trying to hide his unease. And then they were at the door. They didn't knock this time. They stood outside, torches painting orange rings into the snow. The priest stepped forward and called her name, not angrily, calmly, as if he were offering confession. Marit did not rise. She let the silence grow long, let it settle into their bones. Then she stood and walked to the door. She opened it slowly. She didn't flinch when the torchlight met her face. She did not speak. Neither did they. There were 8 of them. 9 if you counted the boy who stood off to the side, holding the bell's staff with both hands, like a prayer he wasn't ready to say. The priest stepped forward, his face unreadable, but his voice was soft. "We must come in." She nodded once. He moved to enter, but paused when he crossed the threshold, his eyes landing on the markings above the door. His lips parted, but he said nothing. The others entered behind him. Marit stepped aside, letting them fill the small space with their warmth and their sweat and their tightly held nerves. One of them scanned the room for signs of the sick man, but found none. The blankets had been folded. The bench was bare. Only the spiral stone remained, resting quietly near the hearth, plain and cold. "She is alone," said one of the men, half whispering. The priest looked at her. "You knew we would come." "I did," she said. "And yet you did not run." "No," she replied. "You only chase what flees." He stared at her a long moment, then nodded. "We will search." She nodded again, slowly. "Search, then." They moved through the space with awkward hands, looking beneath the table, opening jars they didn't understand, peering behind the hanging herbs as though secrets might cling to the leaves. But there was nothing to find, no crime to name, no proof to burn. And slowly the fear in their faces began to waver, because fear, like a flame, needs fuel. And she had given them none. She had simply waited and stood and remembered. The search didn't last long. There were only so many places a single-room cottage could hide secrets. One by one, the men retreated from their anxious fumbling, leaving behind overturned jars, scattered herbs, and the brittle smell of dried sage crushed under careless boots. The priest was the last to move. He stood near the hearth, staring at the spiral stone on the table. He didn't touch it. Perhaps he understood on some level that to reach for something sacred with hands shaped by fear would do him no good. Or perhaps he simply knew it would remain cold to him, no matter how long he stared. Marit stood quietly by the door, watching. She made no effort to stop them, nor did she offer answers. She had no fire in her eyes, no anger etched into her mouth. What she held was steadier than outrage. It was the calm of deep knowing, the kind that lives in tree rings and river stones. She watched their movements with the stillness of someone who had seen the pattern before, who had read the rhythm and knew it always resolved the same way. That truth, when left untouched, becomes the one thing people fear more than lies. When they had finished their searching, they stood in a loose huddle in the center of the room, not knowing quite what to say. The priest looked at Marit one last time. His eyes searched her face, not for guilt, but for something older. He had come looking for shadows and found mirrors instead. What he saw, looking back at him, was not defiance. It was reflection, and it unsettled him. He stepped forward and placed something on the table beside the spiral stone. A small pouch, the kind used by the sisters of the chapel to carry holy salts. It was old and frayed and tied with a strip of cloth that had once been white. He said nothing, and neither did she. Then, with a short nod, he turned and left. The others followed. One by one, they stepped out into the snow, their torches casting long, trembling shadows as they returned to the narrow path that led through the trees. No one lit the bell that night. No words were shouted back, and no fire was set to the door. Marit closed it gently behind them, and for the first time since dusk she exhaled. The room had gone quiet again, but not empty. The walls seemed to breathe with her now, the floorboards warm beneath her soles, the herbs above her head swaying slightly in the stillness. She walked to the table and looked at the pouch. She did not open it. Whatever it held didn't matter. It wasn't a gift or a curse. It was a leaving. A way of saying without words that something had shifted and the lines they once drew so sharply were starting to blur. She returned to the hearth and sat down on the stool beside the fire. The flame had begun to settle into its final glow, orange and low, just enough to warm the stone. She leaned forward, placing her hands near it, palms open. The spiral stone beside her no longer hummed or pulsed. It simply rested. Its work had been quiet from the start. Outside, the snow thickened, soft and unhurried. The forest leaned in again, this time not as watcher or guide, but as kin. Marit listened to the way the wind curled around the edges of the roof, how the wood shifted with the cold, how the world held its breath not out of fear, but out of awe. Something had passed through, not loudly, not violently, just surely, and it had left her standing. Later, much later, when the moon had climbed high enough to make the snow glow silver, Marit stood and stepped outside. The cold met her cheeks gently, not biting, but bracing. The air smelled of pine and ash and the faint sweetness of thawing herbs. She looked up at the sky where clouds had parted, revealing stars so still they felt like they had been placed there, just for tonight. And then she looked down at her path. There, in the snow, was the faint impression of the spiral, not drawn by hand, not carved, simply formed as if the snow itself had remembered it. She stood within it, letting its soft curve guide her breath. And then she turned back inside, not hiding, not waiting, but continuing. The fire waited, the stone rested, and Marit, the girl they once feared, the girl who healed, the girl who remembered, sat by the hearth once more. The spiral did not end, it only deepened. And the night, so full of snow and silence, embraced her, softly, completely, forever.